I'll point out 5 episodes starting.
Right.
But then like so like I agree to
For those of you who don't know me, hi, my name is Liza. I'm excited to welcome you all to this event, which wouldn't have been possible without the help of Hillel, our student host, and of course, our 4 panelists. When I first started planning this event with Rachel and Rabbi Talbot, we thought it would have been incredible to get just one of our 4 panelists here tonight. The fact that all 4 said yes is amazing. It also, I think, speaks to the fact that this campus really wants to be discussing these things right now. With the recent events at the Taliban, many of us have begun to wonder, is history repeating itself? Or perhaps are we overreacting? Should we be waiting before we run to the next protest? And yet, isn't waiting a privilege in itself? While the recent protests have attracted people of all faiths and colors, there seems to be a striking and unignorable parallel between the xenophobia today and that of the Holocaust. While this panel will discuss these parallels from an academic perspective, I challenge you all to ask yourselves what these parallels mean for you and your role in this world. In 1988, Yehuda Elkana, a Holocaust survivor, wrote, "Two nations, metaphorically speaking, emerged from the ashes of Auschwitz. A minority who assert this must never happen again, and a frightened and haunted majority who assert this must never happen to us again." Today, I challenge you all to ask yourself which version of never again you're carrying on with you, and which version is most needed in the world right now. What standards should we be holding ourselves and our version of never again up to? What does never again mean if not the universalist version? With these questions in mind, I'm very excited to welcome our 4 panelists and our moderator, Rabbi Talbot, our JLIC rabbi here, who's also pursuing his PhD in medieval Jewish history. So I'm much too intimidated to introduce 4 extremely qualified Penn professors. I ask you all to give me a warm welcome to Rabbi Talbot as he comes up and introduces our event.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yaakov Talbis. I'm a rabbi here at Penn Hillel. Before we begin, I want to make a quick few thank yous to everyone who helped make this panel possible. First off, a huge thank you to Liza Bernstein, you just heard from. This was her brainchild, and she really will single-handedly put this whole thing together. I'd also like to thank the Student Host Committee who helped prepare and advertise the event. If they could just quickly stand up for a minute. Thank you to Rachel Hollander and the other Penn Hill staff as well. Thank you to Bob Williams and Jose, the maintenance staff for the setup. And finally, thank you to our 4 panelists who will introduce Mr. Bowman. On January 27th, President Donald Trump issued Executive Order 13769. The order limited the total number of refugee arrivals in the United States for 2017 and suspended the U.S. refugee admissions program for 120 days. The order also indefinitely suspended the entry of Syrian refugees. Further, the order suspended the entry of alien nationals from 7 Muslim-majority countries, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, for 90 days. The order was met with widespread condemnation from various groups who referred to the order as, quote, a Muslim ban. The order also faced immediate legal challenges from the ACLU and others who challenged the constitutionality of the ban as well as the manner in which it was being carried out. Many Jewish groups drew comparison between the order and American policy severely restricting immigration from Europe during World War II, a policy that prevented thousands of Jews from escaping Europe with catastrophic results. At airports around the country, the slogan of "Never Again" was invoked to encourage Jews and others to take action to prevent America's doors being closed to refugees, as those doors may have been closed to their ancestors. To pick one example, the Association of Jewish Studies, an academic organization representing Jewish studies scholars worldwide, issued a statement condemning the order, which included a line that read, "As scholars of Jewish history and culture, we remember the disastrous impact of the 1924 National Origins Act, which limited immigration into America of Jews fleeing European persecution." End quote. The goal of tonight's panel is to ask, has nothing changed? Are these comparisons valid? Is the contemporary banning of refugees and limiting immigration from several Muslim majority countries at all parallel to America limiting the number of Jews arriving on these shores in the early 20th century? Are we not learning from history and thus doomed to repeat its mistakes? We've asked the panelists to discuss under what lens and in what context we understand this order and what comparisons can be made. What was the historical background to America's policies then, and what led to the executive order now? Are the parallels in the political or societal spheres? What role does race play in any of this? We invite the panelists to discuss these issues and more. Now to introduce our four panelists. Dr. Beth S. Wenger is the Moritz and Josephine Berg Professor of History here at Penn, where she serves as chair of the History Department. She is also one of four founding historians who helped to create the core exhibition at the National Museum of American Jewish History here in Philadelphia, and she continues to serve as the historical consultant to the museum. Dr. Ian Lustig is the Best West Heyman Professor of Political Science here at Penn. His research interests include comparative politics, international Middle Eastern politics, and agent-based computer-assisted modeling for the social sciences. Dr. Ben Nathans is the Ronald S. Louder Endowed Term Associate Professor of History here at Penn, where he teaches and writes about Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, modern European Jewish history, and the history of human rights. Finally, Dr. Lynn Weisberg is the Christopher H. Brown Distinguished Professor of Arts and Science and Professor of German and Comparative Literature, also here at Penn. Her research interests focus on late 18th century to early 20th century German literature and philosophy, including German Jewish studies. In spring 2016, she taught a course entitled Witnessing, Remembering, and Writing the Holocaust. All four of them have published extensively and are well respected in their field, and we are honored that they're here tonight. We invite the four of them to come up to the table right now. Round of applause. The format is each of the professors will have a chance to some opening few minutes of opening remarks. Then we'll have some follow-up questions that we'll hear in advance based on those remarks, and then we'll open up the to questions from the audience. Microphone turned on. Should be on.
Okay, first of all, thank you to the organizers. This is a wonderful event. I'm thrilled to see students interested in putting today's events in historical context. So as an historian, I have to tell you that one of my least favorite cliches is those who do not remember history are doomed to repeat it. And that is because this is an unhelpful idea. History does not repeat. It doesn't happen again exactly in the same terms. There are patterns to be discerned, parallels to draw, but things do not happen again. Which is not to say in any way that we shouldn't find this Muslim ban abhorrent and do everything in our power to overturn it and hope the courts continue to overturn it. My point is that the program of ethnic genocide that took place in the events that culminated in the Holocaust developed and were enforced in a very different context than what we see, for example, in the horrific events following the Syrian civil war. The historical situation is simply different. Now we know, at some of the examples you mentioned, the tragic history of the St. Louis being turned around in 1939, the many international conferences about Jews that took place between the United States and Britain and many other nations that resulted in absolutely nothing. Palestine didn't raise its quotas, the British wouldn't do it, the United States didn't raise its quotas, and it left some unfilled. So there are certainly parallels to be found in this. To me, if there's anything heartening going on right now, and a key difference, it's that today's refugee crisis is much more in the headlines, much more on the front page than the Jewish situation was then. This may have to do with social media. This may have to do with the fact that we're not in the midst of a world war. But in fact, we can get protesters showing up at a moment's notice at airports the minute the ban goes into effect. Because of the way that knowledge spread, this simply was not possible in earlier moments. But I do want to say something about not just the Jewish experience, but the American experience. And here's where we can see a pattern in U.S. history, frankly a disturbing one, that along with a nation that touts itself as the nation of immigrants, there's also a very long history of fear of immigrants and immigrant exclusion that we can trace very far back. I'll just start in the 19th century with Chinese exclusion, with limits at the turn of the 20th century to not only Jews out, but Slavs and Italians, Southern and Eastern Europeans, and many others, and Japanese who were interned in World War II, whether citizen or not. So there has been a thread that's run up and down in American history where our elected leaders and our government has investigated formally immigrants, found them to be inferior, disease-ridden, criminals, destroying American society, a danger to the country. And if this sounds familiar, it should. It is a strain in our country's history, along with progressive and reform strains that have responded to that kind of nativism. Both are who we are as a country, and it's about deciding what kind of country we want to be. Now, I'm going to give it to my colleagues, but I do want to say one final thing in where I sit as a professor of Jewish history. I do understand the long Jewish experience is deeply connected to issues of refugee, expulsions, bans. Jews have been barred from countries precisely on the grounds of their perceived threats to security and unity. And here there are parallels we can learn from. Not an exact replica of what's happening now, but lessons to draw from. So I would say personally, it's both as a Jew and as an American that I believe we need to insist on humanitarian and moral action in the case of these refugees. And we can understand this moment in our own time in terms of our own historical experience and act as we hoped others would have when Jews were the ones who were in peril.
I guess that settles that. I'm next.
I don't know, you're next to me. So.
Well, thanks, Beth, and thank you for having me here this evening on this really important topic. You know, you can never find a perfect triangle, right? You all know that. You've never actually seen a perfect triangle. That is, you've never been able to see, and you never will see, something that is a triangle and only a triangle. You'll find something that's a triangular set of lines. You'll never find something that is only a triangle. Clifford Geertz said something similar about human beings. He said, there is no such thing as a human being. You've never seen a human being in the same sense that you've never seen a perfect triangle. Because every human being that you see is some sort of human being. Culturally, in terms of gender, there's some kind of human being. You cannot be a human being without being a certain kind of human being. Culture is impregnated in us. There is no human being that is not somehow a special kind of human being, in part because of their culture. Now, Hannah Arendt, whose work is being quoted constantly these days, the author of this, mostly because she's the author of this book, Origins of Totalitarianism, said something akin to that. She said, there is no such thing as human rights. Nobody can have a human right. In the sense that the only thing that enforces rights, that can protect you and your property and a place to live, are states. So if you are not a citizen of a state or have papers authorizing you to have the protection of that state, you are, in effect, not a human with rights. You are not someone that has the right to have rights as the world actually works, regardless of how we may idealize it. She went out of her way in this book, and also in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, to explain that it was the statelessness of the Jews that exposed them to utter destruction. And she emphasized the meticulousness of the Nazis in respecting that fact. That is, until a Jew was stripped of their passport, whether it was a German passport or a Portuguese passport or a Bolivian passport, they could not be exterminated and actually had to be respected in terms of the request requests of the government that they had a state citizenship relationship to. Statelessness is what made it possible to treat beings as non-beings. I think one way to ask whether there are comparisons between then and now is to read a couple passages from this book, which was obviously written about then, and you can decide whether it's about now. The first loss which the rightless suffered, that is those who've been stripped of their citizenship, was the loss of their homes, and this meant the loss of the entire social texture into which they were born, in which they established for themselves a distinct place in the world. This calamity is far from unprecedented in the long memory of history. Forced migrations of individuals or whole groups of people for political or economic reasons look like everyday occurrences. What is unprecedented is not the loss of a home, but the impossibility of finding a new one. Suddenly, there was no place on earth where migrants could go without the severest restrictions, no country where they would be assimilated, no territory where they could found a new community. This, moreover, had next to nothing to do with any material problem of overpopulation. It was a problem not of space, but of political organization. Nobody had been aware that mankind, for so long a time considered under the image of a family of nations, had reached the stage where whoever was thrown out of one of these tightly organized, closed communities found himself thrown out of the family of nations altogether. Now, I want you to note that there are two fundamental ways to be stateless. One way is to have papers that attach you to a state, but that state no longer exists. In fact, Syria no longer exists. So you could have a Syrian passport, but there's nowhere to go back to. Somalia, as a state, practically no longer exists. That was the problem with Palestinian refugees. They no longer had papers to a state that existed. Then there's the problem of people who, the state still exists, but they've lost their papers. That's with the Jews on the St. Louis, where you're stripped of your citizenship. Always already mentioned the role that that played for the Nazis. And there are a variety of variations on this theme. One of those variants we see with undocumented immigrants in the United States. It'd be in the first category if their lives would be in danger by deportation to the state that recognizes them as belonging there. Like you wouldn't, some people can't be sent back to Guatemala, they'll definitely get killed. But in other cases, RN captures the predicament of people who have papers, but they're in the wrong state for those papers. And I want to read you again another passage from RN. Much worse than what statelessness did to the time-honored and necessary distinctions between nationals and foreigners, and to the sovereign right of states in matters of nationality and expulsion, was the damage suffered by the very structure of legal national institutions, when a growing number of residents had to live outside the jurisdiction of laws and without being protected by them. The stateless person without right to residence and without the right to work had, of course, constantly to transgress the law. He was liable to jail sentences without ever committing a crime. More than that, the entire hierarchy of values which pertain in civilized countries was reversed in his case. Since he was the anomaly for whom the general law did not provide, it was better for him to become an anomaly for which it did provide that of the criminal. In other words, if you must live outside the law, you will become a criminal. And that's something that states are producing criminals in that way. Now, to conclude, I want to tell you about, I was in Prague in May during a trip in Central Europe that included visits to Auschwitz and Budapest and so on. In Prague, I went to the Franz Kafka Museum, which is an amazing museum. Many of you have been there. And there is an exhibit on his book, The Castle. Castle is, as most of his books are, a terrifying book about a man who thinks he's going to get a job at the castle, but he can't find the person he's supposed to have the interview with. The whole book is going to the castle, trying to get to the castle, finding the interview, being told it's the wrong date, it's the wrong entrance, and so on. Next to the exhibit, the summarize the book. And here's how they did it, because the man comes to the village and asks questions about how to get to the castle. So here's the summary. It's a chilling summary, and it captures, as only Kafka can, in a few words, exactly what it means and meant to be a Jew in Europe for hundreds of years, and what it means for any stateless person now. You are not from the castle. You are not from the village. Therefore, you are nothing. Unfortunately, you are something.
Thank you very much. I have to turn it on, I learned. Before I begin, I want to introduce myself as a practical example. I was born as a refugee. You have somebody in front of you who is not only supposed not to be here. Actually, I was a refugee not to this country, but another country. You find somebody here who does not really exist. I can prove my non-existing by a birth certificate to a person who does not exist. And by sheer logic, analytical or otherwise, you cannot be born to a non-existing person. Ben and Ian, you didn't know that I'm absent. And here I am. I have then taken it upon myself, without discussing it with Ian during my life, to acquire as many passports as possible. And have managed to acquire a few, which is not what would do me anything good at the present administration, but we will talk about this. Beth has talked about American immigration, both in terms of policy, but also the historical perspective. Ian has given us the example of Arendt as a way to understand the status of the refugee and the stateless. Actually, you have done more than that, because the example of the triangle is the privileged example for the philosophers of the German Haskalah, Maimon and Ben David. You knew that. You also knew that there is a very important article by Hannah Arendt on the castle, in which she says that it is the agency of K not to want to belong to the village or the castle, and that sets him free, which is the opposite to what they wanted in the exhibit. I want to remark on something totally different. I want to think about why there should be no immigration. This is rather curious. And whether this why gives us some idea of peril or not. Because in one way, you can think immigrants are rather useful. You have a birth statistics, and there are many countries where the birth statistic is not very positive in the future. You have employment figures. You need people in the STEM fields. There are even encouragements at this and other universities that you should get into engineering, technology, and so on. Many of the people who apply to come here from Syria or other countries are in this field. They are not all unlearned and unemployed or whatever, so that would be good. International trade is not always negative. Sometimes it can be good. It can be good. Just today, you know, we have an alien country up north, Canada. They were talking about trade there, no wall there. So that's fine. And there is an international exchange of knowledge and research. Perhaps one of the reasons why I'm here, but maybe not. Maybe I'm here accidentally. So these are all very good reasons. And still no immigration. And one word and one notion that was brought up again and again is something that I want you to think about. Safety. There is an Office of Homeland Security, and we are asked to be safe, and we don't feel safe, A, with immigrants, B, with refugees, and C, with foreigners. It is, of course, a slippery slope to decide who's a refugee and who's an immigrant. It's even more slippery to decide who's a foreigner. But the question of insisting that the safety of one's own country can be protected by keeping people out and building a wall, only to the south, of course, not to the north, is something we should think about. Because, first of all, it decides who's a foreigner and who's not, inside or outside. But also it limits geographically what we are supposed to feel who we are. And that is particularly interesting in a country, as Beth has said, that is, with all the problems and all the contradiction, based on the idea of immigration, and has indeed lived for a long time with the myth of blank space. The immigrants came and there was nobody there. It took us a long time to revise this. It's also a society that has for a long time prided itself to be multicultural. What does it mean to say we are multicultural? We have many voices, we have many different backgrounds, but we don't like foreigners and don't like people to come in. And a country that is legally permitting people like me to be here, people with multiple citizenship. What do you do with them? Half of you is foreign, half of you not. You can come in with your right foot, but not with your left. You know, what does that mean? I mean, how is that legal position to be negotiated here? There are countries that do not permit it. The US permits it. And this history of safety, that we want to be safe, is of course a history that I, coming from German lands, or also from German lands, after what I said, I have to say that, among others from German lands, am very familiar with. The first concentration camp, Dachau, was already built in 1933. It wasn't built for Jews. It was built for the safekeeping of the German people. It's a safety camp, that's what it was called. It was outside Munich, very open, no hiding about it, and it was for political prisoners, and it was a place of warning. You have to be safe, and to keep you safe, we will bring those people who might endanger your safety there. So the first victims were actually political in the camps, and the first victims in terms of extermination weren't Jews either. It was euthanasia, those who didn't fit in. So we might want to think about this odd relationship between those who are handicapped in one way or the other and those who are foreign. There was no difference done then. And secondly, it was, before we talk about immigration, it happened in the country itself. The Jews were regarded as foreigners. Jews themselves, German Jews, thought of themselves as Germans of a Jewish religion. But now they were not Germans, they were foreigners. And the interesting way is, you were talking about passport ein, the passport was important. And it wasn't the question whether you had one or not, but whether you had the designation Jew in the passport. And that was actually an idea that didn't come from the Germans, but from the Swiss. The Swiss didn't want to have refugees from Germany coming across the border and have a control, so they asked the German government to put the stamp J into Jewish passports and mark Jews further with first names and so on. That was then a German idea, to be able to monitor it. So the passport was marked, and you were basically made a foreigner. So I want you to think about it, that foreigners aren't just there, but they are being made. And do with that concept of nation at all, if it allows that or something else. And I just want to bring in one other example as we talk about safety, and then I will stop because Ben has to talk. And the other example has nothing to do with Jews and nothing to do with the Nazi period, but has to do something with walls. When the wall was erected between East and West Germany, it was called a safety wall, a Schutzwall, by the way, East. So again, it was erected for safekeeping. So I want you to think, in what condition are we that safety in that sense becomes urgent in this way?
Thank you. When I teach a lecture class or a seminar, I make a very strong effort not to allow my personal political views to be visible or to enter the discussion. And sometimes students find this frustrating because they feel like they're playing a game of cat and mouse with me. And the reason for that, and I'm not the only Penn professor who does that, is that it's unfair to students to place you in a situation of dependency on the person who's going to be giving you a grade and having to adapt to that person's political views if they're known. The good news is that this is not a class. You're here because you're interested in the topic. And therefore, I am liberated from that self-restriction of concealing my political views or camouflaging them. So that's my first footnote. My second is just to express a note of thanks to the organizers, but also regret that no one on this panel, I'm guessing since I know these people, no one on this panel is a supporter of Trump or of the policies. And that is truly unfortunate because it creates a kind of monochrome discussion here. It would be much more fruitful if we could somehow, somewhere, dig up a Penn faculty member who would publicly represent the Trump or the White House view on this. But we have who we have, and I think it's been interesting so far. Okay. I have a couple of things I want to say, and I want to be brief because time is short, and we want to have plenty of time for Q&A and for discussion and conversation. So Ian mentioned this absolutely crucial book by Hannah Arendt, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and that famous passage about human rights not existing outside the framework of states. The election of Donald Trump, similar to the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union, and the looming surge, if not success yet, of right-wing movements in the Netherlands and in France, and possibly in other European countries. I can mention others like Hungary, but the list is long. I think all of these are tied to a very different version of the threat to states that Ian referenced in Arendt's work. Arendt was talking about failed states, about states that collapsed. But in our time, the great threat to states and national sovereignty has much more often been perceived as coming from globalization. And all of the right-wing movements that I just mentioned, including Trump, are in one way or another, to one degree or another, reactions against globalization and the perception that global norms and all of the regimes of international law and trade that go with them are an existential threat to the sovereignty of nation states. I think it's worth putting that out there because one of the arguments that's now in play about the ban that was issued by the White House is whether this does or does not serve the national interest of the United States, and also whether the national interest is the right rubric for deciding questions of immigration and refugee status. It is true, as Liliana said, that some of the refugees and some of the immigrants whose futures are at stake in these policies would bring considerable benefit to the United States in the form of their skills, their technical know-how, and other assets. But surely we have to recognize that the lion's share of the refugee problem and of the immigration problem is not about people like that. The lion's share is about people for whom I think only a moral case can be made for admitting them to the United States. The moral case was certainly what governed Germany's policy and the very dramatic admission of, to date, over 1 million refugees from Syria. So if we're going to discuss this in moral terms, then I think we need to, for purposes of this panel, have at least two things in mind. One is the direct or indirect moral culpability of the United States for the collapse of the Syrian state, insofar as we initiated the collapse of other Arabic states, not Syria, but others, and therefore can be construed as the initiator of a chain reaction that is playing itself out, among other places, in Syria now. What might we think about these issues from a Jewish perspective? What would it mean to think with Jewish history about the issues that face the United States today? Not because the United States is obliged to behave in a Jewish manner. Strange land is woven into the DNA of Jewish consciousness. Jewish texts, Jewish experience, Jewish custom. So surely there must be something illuminating and enlightening about that highly particular experience in which the majority of Jews in this country have to go back no more than 2 or 3 generations before they hit the immigrant or the refugee in their own bloodlines. So on the one hand, we have this tradition of Jews as refugees that I think instinctively gives most of us a sense of empathy towards non-Jews, whether it's Muslims or others, who find themselves in this position of desperately fleeing persecution in their own country, or the country they thought there was their own. But there are other aspects of this issue that I just want to bring to your attention and maybe have you think about it, and perhaps we can discuss during the Q&A. First, if you look at the history of Jewish communities and their own policies towards refugees, even towards Jewish refugees, what you'll find is that prior to the 20th century, and particularly the campaigns on behalf of German Jewish refugees, and then most emphatically Soviet Jewish refugees, prior to the 20th century, the typical story is of Jewish communities being extremely careful about who they admitted to their ranks. Not because they were more narrow-minded than we are, or more selfish than we are, but because prior to the 20th century, to be a member of a Jewish community meant to be embedded in an extremely elaborate and expensive social welfare net. And so it was really a question of affordability as to how many strange Jews you could admit into your own community. So I want to just throw a little bit of a different kind of light on the Jewish experience with admitting refugees, even when it comes to people of our own flesh and blood. The second part that I want to throw in, and I'm really going to stop, is we have a Jewish state today. And surely Israel's thinking and policies about immigrants and refugees should be relevant to the way we think about these issues, we being the people in this room. Now, Israel has an unabashedly ethno-religious set of criteria for who can get in under what circumstances. The law of return in the Israeli state is based on a distinction between foreign Jews who have certain automatic rights to become potential Israeli citizens and everybody else. So again, despite what I call the sort of genetic presence of refugee consciousness for Jews, the picture is not simply one of admit anyone who needs admission.
So we should do one follow-up question for each professor, and then we'll open up to the audience. You spoke a lot about how a lot of these issues have been in the headlines lately, and I think a lot of involvement of people that I know has been a lot related to Jewish political power in this country that didn't exist in the same way in the 40s. I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, how that's played a role. I guess without going too much, touching upon the issue of Jews as a minority in this country, and yet where how that has kind of played into things, and why Jews perhaps are able to be more outspoken now than they would have been 75 years ago.
Wow. Well, I have to say that I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. Jews were very outspoken throughout this period. If you're talking about immigration quotas in the teens and 20s and in the 30s, they did not speak in a unified voice. Jews have never spoken in a unified voice. They had different opinions. There were Jews saying, we don't want to talk about a refugee issue in the United States because we should be focusing on opening Palestine. And there were political factions, but they were speaking out. And the other thing, when you speak about Jewish political power, I do accept your premise that Jews have greater and more secure political voices today than they did then. I agree with you, absolutely. However, at the time, the perceived fear of Jewish political power was paramount. You had people in the 1930s calling Roosevelt's New Deal the Jew deal, and if I had a PowerPoint handy and I could show you the Jewish Star portrayals of Roosevelt's cabinet and the hanging Magen David over the Jewish Star over the White House, and so actually Jews were very fearful at the time that their political power might be misinterpreted, all the way going back to those who boycotted German goods before the Holocaust, in the 1930s, when the Nazis first rose to power. Some supported the boycott, said, let's boycott German goods, and others who said, no, we can't boycott German goods, because this is a time of economic deprivation, and we shouldn't in any way give the sense that Jews control the economy. And second, this is going to show that we have too much political power. This is going to work this is going to feed into the hands of those who accuse us of having too much political power. And I will say some of that resonates today in terms of Jewish voices. I think that there still is, I think Jews are more secure and willing to speak out openly than they were then, but there is still a little bit of a fear that Jews have of being too dominant of a political voice. Luckily, it's not stopping most people from talking. So I guess I would say, to me, I see more of a thread of Jews speaking out and finding a way to speak out in the context of their times, which is maybe a longer answer than you wanted.
Professor Lessig, you spoke, I think, from an angle, I think, that the question you thought, which was the idea of what a refugee is. I think for many people, the comparison that was made was less about the refugee status and more about that this was perceived as a Jewish ban during World War II, while today it's a Muslim ban. Now, that may not be accurate on either end, but I think the ethnic or the religious role is what has inspired such strong feelings and strong comparisons. So I wonder if you could perhaps speak about that.
Well, whatever, start out with the idea that in the modern world, it was not true previously. In the modern world, you can have, as Hannah Arendt points out, you can have people who are stripped of all rights to be anywhere. Man without a country used to be this shocking idea. Now we're seeing millions of people without a country. Now, why any particular country would say we don't want those people, they have the right to take them, is an empirical question, and it's very often that, well, they're not like us, or they're dangerous, or they could be dangerous. And one of the things that touches on something that was said, Hannah Arendt pointed out that one solution to being a stateless refugee is to become a genius. And then, like Einstein, everybody wants you. The problem is little Hans Kohn down the street who's just a person. So there can be a fear of Jews because the Nazis have sprinkled some spies among them. And therefore, we can't let any of these men, women, or children in because Nazi spies might come. And the fear that among the Muslims could be some terrorists, so we can't take any of them. It's, it's the same argument, and it's not an unusual argument. I was trying to point out that at the root of this is a disconnect between our feelings that we're all human and an institutional structure that doesn't match those feelings.
Mr. Weisberg, so one issue you brought up was the word that hadn't said it was security. And I think that somewhat has a negative connotation, what can be done in the name of security. But I'd like to believe that if we had someone on the panel who was defending the order, they would cite security as a very real issue. And I wonder if you could speak about, is that, or are there examples of history, or morally, is that something that can be invoked to justify even something that many people might be uncomfortable with?
I think what I said is not just security, but safety. And that is almost the same, but is not quite the same. If you say security, that is mostly a term from the military or a term of a strategic point. The deviousness of this is to use a term like safety to invoke the anxiety about terrorism, the anxiety about instability within the country. That is slightly different from what Ben has mentioned with the social network and coming up for the cost of support. That's a financial one. That question instigates fear. You are producing fear of the foreigner. You're producing fear of the refugees. And I just wonder why we are taught to be fearful. And let me go back to something that Ben said, and that's the question of the moral. I'm an awful person, Ben. I mean, you know this, but the group doesn't know this. I'm an awful person because I don't think any government is making decisions entirely out of moral reasons. The interesting thing is why decisions are made. You were quoting Angela Merkel in Germany. Now there are countries, states in Europe that have a negative birth rate, where the discussion of who is going to pay a pension or social security in just, let's say, 30 years, becomes discussed in great vigor. In Germany, it is first started as a discussion with the guest workers, millions of Turkish people who are now practically almost integrated, but not quite, should be fully integrated, and how, after all, this is the working population, and they do something that the Germans are more or less unwilling to do, have children. So there is another state in Europe which is equally bothered by this negative birth rate. By the way, they all have slightly negative birth rate, with the exception of France. France is stable. And that's Italy. With cease to exist. It's a horrible thought. It's a horrible thought. Think about the culture, the restaurants, the art, whatever. It's just horrible. So what do you do? And there are two different decisions done. And the German decision is, on the one hand, you try to think about policies. Maybe kindergartens would be good. Encourage women to have children and so on. Things like that. And the other is to take people in. Italy went another way. So it has a lot to do with projections of what kind of state you want to have that makes economic sense. So it's not just morals, it's economy. We are back with Marx.
Could I just say something about the security issue? Because I think the argument should be made that we're actually much less secure with this ban in many, many ways. One of the ways is in Iraq. By banning people from Iraq, you're basically telling the people who've been supporting our troops over there that they can't come here. And the very people who are about to defeat ISIS in Mosul can turn right on us, say nothing of opening up 10 times as many opportunities for the Iranians to take over more of Iraq and Syria as a result of the insult. The parliament in Iraq passed a unanimous vote to punish the United States, and what the best idea that they have of how to do it is to ban Americans from coming to Iraq. So the security fallout from this is much worse than in the last one.
Mr. Nathan, so you mentioned how national interest may not be perhaps it's not the good way of assessing these questions. And I think, many people would respond and say, well, we should be following our hearts. But that is, somewhat, making somewhat dubious, especially in light of the, what one could call hypocrisy, I guess, or maybe that's too strong a word, of you saying look out for the stranger, yet the Jewish state you brought up doesn't necessarily, or what Jewish communities look like. So what is there a good arbiter for these types of questions if both national interest and morals are both severely flawed?
Well, national interest, I think, always has to be part of the decision making. I didn't want to say that should be bracketed out. I just think the way many countries discuss the acceptance, say, of refugees from Syria today is not in terms of national interest, but much more in terms of humanitarianism. Now, it may be true that in a country like Germany or other places with depressed birth rates, that there's a pragmatic motive as well. I doubt it's as strong, and I don't think it's an accident that Germany has accepted many, many more refugees than any other European country because of the legacy of Nazism. I don't think Canada is accepting Syrian refugees because it needs more bodies in factories. And of course, the unspoken issue so far in this conversation is that American business leaders tend to favor immigration at very high levels, not, I suspect, out of humanitarian motives, but because they know that more immigrants means cheaper workforce. So I think that national interest can make very cogent arguments for admitting a certain number of immigrants, but I think in a situation like Syria, without a humanitarian argument, you won't get very far.
Okay, we're now going to open up the questions from the audience. So if anybody has anything, just feel free to raise your hand.
Thank you, although I would defer to the students.
Yes, and we're going to give students precedence, just because the university, so if any students want to ask the first question, or the second question, they can ask the second question first.
Anything to say? How about a comment?
I think you should go ahead and be an example.
Wait, we have a student.
Okay.
You just stand up and speak loudly.
So Crystal Nacht was justified by the assassination of a German ambassador in Paris by a Polish Jew who was reacting growing anti-Semitism in Germany. And I think we see a similar thing here with Muslims, and the justification was that this is the beginning of the war against the Jews. The Jews fired the first shot. And
answer that. The thing that is so critical about German and Nazi anti-Semitism is when the state gets into that business. That is when things get lethal, when the resources of a sovereign state get mobilized for purposes of anti-Semitic actions. Then it's a whole new ballgame. And that is what is critical about the situation we're in now, is that it is, I don't think it's any longer unthinkable that the power of the American government could be mobilized for purposes of racist or otherwise prejudiced policies. So that to me is the tipping point. There are always going to be greater or lesser degrees of social anti-Semitism or social anti-Islamic sentiment. What side of the equation the government gets in on, though, is the decisive fact, always.
One great difference is whether it's the starting point or not. If you're talking about Kristallnacht, you have an event that was not just happening, but choreographed on every level after a long period in which Jews were already marginalized. And that makes a great difference. Things were already in place, and one was looking for a reason to rig it up. This is rather interesting what is happening here, because somebody gets into the president's seat, and as soon as he's in, is proclaiming a ban that purportedly he has promised his voters. That's a very different situation. And I think that that is bringing out another form of protest. I think you, I don't remember whether it was over dinner or here, comparing it to the 60s. I mean, there is a protest here that was already not there in Germany when it happened.
Why don't we take, thanks to
Any
everybody.
question to the whole panel or a specific question?
Yeah, so my question is, I'd say primarily to you, Professor Nathan. So you mentioned this whole moral calculation that states have to make in whether or not they admit refugees, or perhaps how many refugees they admit. But I certainly agree with you that this is the primary question. I think that going forward, especially with globalization, with the changing American labor market, we're looking for more skilled labor. There's going to be more automation, right? This sort of low-skilled labor, people with not a lot of human capital, that's not really ultimately something that's going to be good for, especially in large influx, it's going to be good for our economy or good for the average American citizen. So my question is, I totally agree that we have some sort of moral obligation to these people. It's very easy for, I think, a lot of Americans to look back just a couple of generations and say, all right, this is my ancestor who came to the States, and it can become difficult to say, what's the real difference here, other than just a couple generations, a little bit of time. What makes me have any more right to be an American than someone who's in Syria right now, for example, right? So I think, given that whole dilemma, you have this real moral sense of obligation to do a lot of things, to help a lot of people, and admit a lot of refugees and immigrants from poorer, more disadvantaged countries around the world. But I think that we can also agree that there's some sort of, there's some sort of limit to that, right? There is capacity. I mean, I don't know if there are any, crazy, very, very far out libertarians on the panel who think we should just open our borders completely. But some would argue that. But I think most people would agree that there's some limit. There's some, whether it be a number of people, a number of a certain type of people, a certain economic class of people, that would put a burden on the country that's sort of outweighs the humanitarian gain. Let's say, maybe dilutes the quality of the country and the quality of life enjoyed by those who are currently in the country to such an extent that it's no longer worth the humanitarian gain. So I'm wondering, where you think that point is, how we sort of negotiate that process with the what we give up as a country and the cost to us to make this really moral and righteous leap and let these people in, and where that, how we decide how many people we let in, who we let in, and how we navigate that process.
Needless to say, there are no easy answers to that question. This is not a mathematical formula, and those who say that building a wall will solve the problem are just as deluded if we still live in a world of nation states, then the quality of our obligation to our fellow citizens is higher than our obligation to non-citizens. Sometimes that's not so pretty, but I do believe that that's true. That our common citizenship creates a qualitatively different moral obligation than simply these are other human beings from other countries. One version of the humanitarian argument is that immigration and migration is one small way to address global inequality. And that if you really want to tackle this extreme and growing gap in wealth, that allowing people to cross borders is an excellent way to begin. And I think there's some truth to that, but the very, very poorest people tend not to be the ones who have the means, the resources to move. So it's not a perfect technique by any means, even for something as fundamental as lessening global inequality. I would say that if I were designing a system that tried to balance, as you put it, sort of the humanitarian interest versus the economic interest, not that those two are always at cross purposes, I would first and foremost make it a democratic process. We got very close under George W. Bush and then Obama, more so under Bush, towards articulating and legislating a national immigration policy, which for all its flaws, at least had the virtue of being worked out by the elected representatives of the voting public. What drives me crazy, among many things, about these executive orders is that they don't come from anybody except this cabal of people in the White House who can't even get their facts straight about the source of the problem and possible intelligent solutions. Anybody who's been reading the paper doesn't need to hear me say that the 7 countries on that list have not sent us a single terrorist, not just since 9/11, but in 9/11 itself. The 2 countries that were the suppliers of the 9/11 attackers were Saudi Arabia and Egypt, who, what do you know, are not on that list. So even if you were a hard-line, national interest, humanitarianism be damned kind of person, this policy is simply idiotic. It doesn't have a chance to achieve its own stated goals.
Can I say one quick thing? And it's going to be very quick, I promise. This is a long, long argument about, not the humanitarian argument, but the economic argument, that there was on the books an immigration policy, it was called the LPC clause, likely to become a public charge, that kept many people out. You had to say you had a profession, and many Jews became instant tailors on those immigration forms. There were lots of tailors in Eastern Europe, but there were lots of people who said they were tailors in Eastern Europe. I think you're right. Nation states, they do have the right, and indeed, in some cases, in many ways, the responsibilities. But this nation has been vetting immigrants for terror and for economic need for a long, long time. It's not new to this moment. It's not remotely new to this moment. And in fact, if you look at the history of immigration, when the economy needs workers, we're pro-immigration. When people feel strained by the economy, we're anti-immigration. That's almost a consistent thread you can find in American history. So I promised I would be short, and I was.
Here's a nifty idea for you. I've actually just thought of it because of your question. But you can say it's an international problem. So the real solution is that countries that have the capacity should share in the burden of absorption, and we should distribute that burden fairly. Every country in the OECD, for example, should have a minimum number as a proportion of their population that they will take. If you want to go lower, then you have to pay so many hundred millions of dollars into a reconstruction fund for the countries from which these refugees are coming. Now, that's the way you can address this in a way that both respects our values and takes seriously what you're saying, which is that each country really should have the right to decide, but they also should be needing to share their wealth. Anybody can take that idea. I don't. Obama.
I wanted to say a couple of things because it seems, which is perfectly okay, but we're not so far we haven't. It doesn't seem to address the question of comparisons, more specific comparisons between the ban and World War II. And I just want to say that what's the conflict and clash of values between humanitarianism and economics, and that's always going to be there. What seems to complicate the situation now is that the ban seems totally spurious because and hate mongering and fear mongering because vetting procedures have been in place. And it's not as if we've had attacks from anybody. Of course, who knows, maybe the CIA and FBI, et cetera, have caught certain, and they have, certain examples come to mind, certain terrorists. But by and large, it's not as if we have been under this tremendous threat. So that's what makes the current ban, I think, very disturbing to a lot of us. Having said that, though, and a touch related to what you said, Professor Lustig, there are, and there are other places in the world that these refugees can go. As a matter of fact, the entire Arab world, where they would be, well, let's put it this way, that many features of their culture, especially, would be a lot closer to what they already had. Now, it doesn't take away from our responsibility to a certain degree, but that's very different from what faced the Jews, where there was, in fact, absolutely no place for them to go.
They were responsible to that?
And I'm sorry, the one other thing I wanted to add, with all due respect to Hannah Arendt and you, I find that definition of existential validity or existence, being recognized as an entity, very problematic.
So we'll just maybe stick to them, because I think that's going to get us in a very different direction.
Okay.
So let's,
I'll talk later. Please.
I'm no Middle East expert, but the response in the Arab/Muslim world to the refugee crisis has been incredibly diverse. I mean, Jordan and Turkey are groaning under the burden of the refugees that they've had to accept for mostly geographical reasons, whereas, true to form, Saudi Arabia doesn't take anybody. So it's a mixed picture. It's not black or white. I just want to say that.
We have a lot of Vietnamese restaurants around here. They're excellent. You know why? Because we fought a neo-colonial war in Vietnam. We have a lot of Central American restaurants that are very good for similar reasons. And we should have a tremendous number of Iraqi and Syrian restaurants because we are responsible more than any other country for what has happened. So
Because that food is excellent.
So what I see this ban as is a artificial retardation in the natural flow of people who are going to be coming here, because whenever we get involved in a neo-colonialist war, we produce catastrophes there that we don't own up to. The question, I want to say one other thing about the terrorism thing. Here's my concern. You're right. There is no real terrorist threat in a way that at all. It's really the body language, and to tell you the truth, the wording of this ban is actually not itself that terrible. What's terrible is the context within which it's issued, the dog whistles that it represents, and the hate mongering it fosters. The other thing that nobody is talking about is that at just the time when the CIA is being alienated by a president who would rather trust the KGB or the FSB, is that ISIS is going down the same tunnel toward the dustbin of history that Al-Qaeda was going down when it realized that the only way it could save itself was to attack us, triggering a massive overreaction, which then gave them decades more of life, to say nothing of creating more generation of terrorists. Right now, we are in danger of ISIS coming to the same conclusion. They have not actually used their power to come here directly, but a spectacular attack on the United States with this knucklehead in power could produce a response an order of magnitude worse than this war in Iraq. And our intelligence community is not in a position, as it should be, to watch for that because of the demoralization that is bound to have occurred inside it. So that's what we have to be alert to. It's like, why did so many people die of the Spanish flu after World War I? And why were they the healthy people? Because what killed them was not the flu, it was the immune response to the flu that killed them. That's what will destroy us, our own overreaction to something like a new 9/11 that happens on this guy's watch.
You were speaking earlier about, like, in the 30s or earlier, this fear of Jews showing too much power. And right now, as you said, we have a lot more security, but there still is that fear. So do you think, in light of, like, Trump's, like, volatility, because of a fear of, like, some sort of repercussions that will end up being bad for, like, all of us?
No.
Is it time to talk about the Kushner?
No. Wait just a second. So let me, to answer your question, no, I don't think this is the time for Jews or any other group to step back. No, I don't think so. I think this is for a time for us to step forward. I also, look, this is also a constant strain, this notion. It's a constant strain in anti-Semitic jargon, the notion of disproportionate Jewish political power. It has roots far back, centuries and centuries, in the very birth of the emancipation of Jews in Europe. It was a fear, those debates had embedded in them a fear of Jewish political power. This is very long-standing. I absolutely think the wrong response is to speak in fear, and there's also a great paradox. The paradox is, while Trump's campaigns have all sorts of, to use your phrase, dog whistles about anti-Semitism, about Jewish money and power that were embedded in his campaign, he also has these very close advisors, Jewish daughter, Jewish son-in-law, and certain Jewish advisors, one of whom was very prominently on this Sunday's talk shows. So there's a very complicated Jewish moment going on here. And I think we have to see how the way that it both is part of his power and also being used by him to show too much Jewish power. But regardless of either of those, I think stepping back is a huge, huge mistake at this moment for Jews or anybody else.
Ben, do you want to ask one last question?
Last question, and we'll wrap up. If I could reverse, like we were talking before about argument for just immigration in general, and you suggested like it's even worth considering the economic impact, not just a moral one, especially in this case of refugees. And secondly, like, because I think it muddles the argument when there's these two, including the economic one. And secondly, I know we've like joked about the restaurants, and you've also made a suggestion to pay pensions. How confident are you that it actually does have a strong economic impact? Because, for example, there's a professor here that talks about how Japan's, like Professor Siegel, talks about how Japan's declining population actually has flipped this market very dramatically the last 20, 30 years. But for ours are very globalized, securitized in a way, shape, and form that if this growth is taking place globally, as long as it's even not national, it will still pay here too. It will still buy off the assets that need to be sold by this aging, whatever, retired population. So I'm just concerned that when the response is, and I'm curious if you share the same sentiment, when the response is, oh, look at this economic benefit,
economic issues of this country that have nothing to do with immigration. And you raised one of them, an aging population without the proper safety net, a complete technological revolution that has disempowered and disenfranchised whole generations of workers. We have, as Ben said, a native poor that would be here no matter what of our immigration policies are. So sometimes I think this is sort of a red herring that's used to touch an economic insecurity that exists among us. And although you're right, we have to think about how immigrants fit in an already changing economy, but that changing economy is global.
I think the problem is really economic ignorance. It's clear, if you look at the election, that, and it's clear in Poland and Hungary and Britain, you cannot come up with a democratically arrived at immigration policy without addressing its economic impact. That doesn't make any sense. People will be terrified if they don't understand, or the policy isn't calibrated with an eye to the situation. But what happened in our election is there was this manufactured idea that NAFTA was a disaster for the United States, because in certain states it has had a negative idea, and they were battleground states in the Rust Belt. But for millions of other Americans, for most Americans who make their money by exporting to Mexico, NAFTA is wonderful. And that kind of, that's going to be, what measures of economic performance do you use to understand the benefits of immigration as opposed to its costs? So the one that you were citing is not the same one as you would cite in Canada, for example, where they do want migrants because they have to have young people paying into the welfare state. And that's a good reason why we are benefiting from all these illegal workers who are paying into Social Security, without which our fund would be even lower than it is. So the answer really is more education, more sophistication, so that you can't manipulate the population as easy as it was through falsehoods in this last election.
I think we're kind of out of time at this point. I'm sorry. Yoni Schiff, one of the students who organized this, can make one last closing remark. At that point, if anyone wants to stay, the professors have time to speak. I'm sure they'd be happy to further. Just one last remark.
Hi, everyone. I just want to start off by once again saying thank you to our four panelists, Professors Beth Wenger, Ben Nathan, Lilian Weisberg, and Ian Lustig. We know that you all have incredibly busy schedules and really greatly appreciate you making the time to come share your thoughts with us on such an important topic. So thank you again. Just another round of applause. I also want to thank our moderator, Rabbi Yaakov Taubes, and all the students and all faculty that made this event possible, especially Liza Bernstein, who spearheaded that effort. And lastly, I'd like to leave you all with the following message. I wrote this before the panel, obviously, so perhaps it's not as relevant, but nonetheless, I can't hurt to reiterate it. And that it's the following, that we hope that everyone enjoyed this interesting and stimulating discussion. However, we want this to be more than a simple historical exercise. We hope that everyone recognizes that the reason that we look to history in confusing, challenging times is because we want to learn from the past. We do not simply seek to admonish people from their political views by making these comparisons, but we only wish to add more nuance and perspective to the discussion. It is often difficult to assess widespread trends as they are unfolding, but we hope that by comparing some of what is taking place today to historical developments of the past, we can all better understand the severity and magnitude of current events in an appropriate context. We do not make these comparisons because we wish to be alarmist. Rather, we turn to our past in hopes of bettering our future. History can teach us what preventative and proactive measures can and need to be taken during times like these. And history also shows us the dire consequences if we neglect this responsibility to act in